Walter Pories has spent his life in academic medical centers as a surgeon, educator, and leader. I had the opportunity to work with him as a medical student when he invited senior medical students to spend a month with him learning what it was like to be an academic surgeon. I remember these experiences as if they were yesterday. What struck me then, and still does today, was the transparency he used in his teaching methods, his commitment to fundamental values, and his love of the community around him in his profession.
I was born in Munich in 1930 and grew up there during the Nazi times, and because of that, my family sent me to my uncle's house, who lived in a little town called Scheyern. And there we had a really bucolic life in farm country. He and his wife were both very active physicians. Life was pretty good. We were assimilated. I had no idea that we had a Jewish background. But in 1936, our family was notified correctly that we were Jews on both sides of the family. And from that point on, we wore gold stars and that said Jew on it. And we were not allowed to then go to any school except a Jewish school, and there was only one that was in Munich. But in 1938, during that Kristallnacht, that got burned partly, and then we went to school in a burned building. My dad really is a central part of the story here. He was a decorated veteran from the First World War, and I think in many ways he thought that all of this was going to disappear. He'd also played semi-pro soccer, so he was always disappointed to have a little kid like me who wanted to draw, write poetry, when he wanted a jock. Anyway, he didn't get a jock. In 1923, when he was walking through the streets of Munich, suddenly some gunfire broke out. And so he ducked behind a building, and he saw the guys who were shooting were the guys from his army unit in the First World War. And so he said, I don't know what it was all about, but I shot and didn't do much. And that was the end of that story until May of 1939, which is pretty late. We still were unable to get a visa to get out of Germany. So we were arrested at 4 in the morning and brought to first the Munich headquarters and taken out to Dachau, the concentration camp. But my dad was not there. My dad was off on a business trip. And then we were put on a train, and it took 3 days to get to the border between Germany and Poland. Just before they got to our car, the Polish guards arrived. This was in no man's land between Germany and Poland. And said, we don't like Jews either, but you're not going to shoot them here. Well, when my dad came back from a business trip, he learned that we were gone. We'd been arrested. So with this black coat, the gold star, he walked into Nazi headquarters. To his surprise, out came the number 2 guy at that office and said, Theo, what are you doing here? And what's this gold star business? They'd been together in the same unit in World War I. And so my dad told him what had happened, that we were Jews, and noticed. And the guy said, well, you helped us in 1923, and we don't forget. And they then took us off to a little chapel, changed our names, gave us different identification, and got us to Portugal.
And they were very lucky to escape the country in 1939, fleeing first to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and then on to the United States, where they settled in the Milwaukee area. Walter attended Wesleyan College.
I wanted to be an artist, and I played music in various bands and was an art major and a music minor and had virtually no science. And then came a day when I was asked to get the homecoming band because of my interest in music, and I found these guys and they started to play, and it was glorious. They were fabulous musicians. And he said, "Hey kid, aren't you the kid who wanted to sit in with us? Why don't you go get your horn?" So I got my horn, and in about 10 seconds it was evident I'd never ever get to that level of music. And I said, I better go to medical school. And I left the dance, went upstairs and applied for medical school. How to get to be a doctor. I did get interviews at 2 places where they didn't require any science. One was Harvard, and the other was Rochester, where there was the dean was a Nobel Prize winner, and it was one of those days where he would personally interview the students. And I walked in, he said, "You've had a lot of art." I said, "Yes." And then he talked about art. I said very little, and I got admitted. And then after a year, probably in the first maybe half a year at medical school, he stopped me in the hall and he said, "You know, weren't you the guy who didn't have much science?" He said, "You better work in a lab." So I went back to Dean's office and they said, "There's this crazy guy named Strain, but it's the only job we have available." So I went to see this guy. He looked like Einstein with his hair all over the place. And when I joined him, he was interested in amino acids and their role in healing. And so he gave rats fake amino acids, and the rats had small wounds and burns. And what his point was that you could find out where that amino acid might be critical because the healing would stop at that point. But one group of rats healed much faster. They healed faster than the controls because he realized that in the precipitation of that amino acid, zinc was used to do the precipitant. He said, "Go look up zinc." The only thing I found out was that zinc was extremely important in agriculture. You couldn't grow tobacco in North Carolina, for example, unless you added zinc to the soil. And there was absolutely nothing I could find about animals or man. And then we gave zinc to the rats, and it duplicated the rapid healing. So once we started doing this work, it made a huge difference in animal agriculture. And then, of course, we then showed it was also important in man. Then we showed it led to better healing in man. Then we showed that you needed it for growth and development of embryos. And by that time, the industry itself had shown that it was a really major contributor in nutrition. We were using TPN like everybody else, and at 3 weeks, it became apparent that people get really scaly skin, and the skin would be discolored and things wouldn't heal. So it didn't take much thinking to say, well, maybe the problem is that TPN doesn't have any trace elements in it. And it happened to be that Dudrick and I were fairly good friends. We were both interns at about the same time. And so we talked about this, and then it became apparent to both of us that maybe what needed to be done was to put trace metals into TPN. I got this phone call that said, we'd like to come to Greenville to look at a job. And we had this little book with a map on it, and I looked up Greenville. There's no Greenville in North Carolina. So I said, who is this? Is this a joke? My chair was Bill Holden was chaired case, and he said, did you get that call from Greenville? I said, it's a great job. You can start a medical school. He said, call him back. So I called him back.
When Walter came to this area, he says, what's an operation that the private surgeons aren't really doing, because we don't want to upset them. So he says, there's a lot of obesity in the East.
And I read a paper that said that this chap Mason had found a new operation that he called the gastric bypass. And it was a loop that went up to the proximal segment, and we did 2 cases. People lost weight, but they vomited bile. So we said, we'll add a Roux-en-Y. And we managed to follow 837 patients from 1980 to 1996 with a 95% follow-up. And that then, it's still the world's most intensely followed too, but that showed the weight stays off, diabetes goes away, hypertension goes away, and all these things. Our patients were losing weight, and there was a guy named Jose Carroll. And he came down and he said, Walter, I have this fat patient who's a diabetic I can't control. Maybe he'd do better if he lost some weight. So we operated it, and the glucose was normal. He sent me 2 more patients, and the glucose was normal afterwards. And then the 5th one, it became apparent that this was really different. Diabetes, considered incurable, was suddenly disappearing.
12 years ago, largely as a result of the efforts of Dr. Pories, the NIH funded and established a research consortium which came to be known as the Longitudinal Assessment of Bariatric Surgery, or LABS. Dr. Pories was instrumental in helping guide the consortium to establish the research priorities, analyses, and reporting.
I think one of his greatest contributions has been the gastric bypass, which was sort of a community contribution in the United States, but the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, the modification of the original Mason procedure, is to a great extent due to his credit. His paper in 1995 on what gastric bypass can do for type 2 diabetes is a milestone in the entire history of surgical contributions to knowledge.
I was a home health care nurse. I didn't like ORs at all. And I said, oh, I don't want to go meet this guy in the OR.
We met, and we went around, and I knew when I saw her, that's someone I'm going to marry.
Well, that was mine too. By the end of the day, I thought, yeah, that's the one. That's the one I want to marry. Oh my goodness.
Her great legacy has been to raise our 4 girls that I had from the first marriage. And she's become their mother, she's become their guide, and under her tutelage, they've all developed into really successful, wonderful people. Her legacy is much more important than mine.
I think globally, we would have to say the development of bariatric surgery and the discovery that bariatric surgery results in remission of diabetes. Because I really do think that ultimately the cure will be found through that route. So I think globally that's probably your biggest contribution.
I cannot claim either the zinc or the diabetes or gastric bypass as my own, because those were all done as a group. And so I think my legacy is getting people to work together.
Any acknowledgement of Walter's legacy has to include the development of this department of surgery. from the impoverished tobacco and cotton fields of this region in the eastern part of North Carolina. By founding a Department of Surgery, he has allowed my predecessors, Dr. Randy Chitwood, to develop and present robotic cardiac surgery to the world, and for Dr. Mike Rotundo to bring the initiatives of the college in the care of the injured trauma patient to this region. Finally, and probably most importantly, Walter was able to recruit and train individuals in subspecialties of surgery who remained in the region and provided care to patients who would otherwise not have access to that care.
He loves the human spirit. He loves people, and he loves the potential he sees in people, both in his patients and in his students, and he takes the time to invest in people, and that's what makes him great.
You were a perfect counterpoint to a conversation about how aspirational you can be in science. I was always encouraging us to only add the variables that had a specific scientific question associated with them. You were always trying to elevate the conversation about all the amazing things we could learn if we only knew all the details about everything. We fought back and forth for years on this until you finally ended the debate one day by gently nudging me with a cartoon that you had drawn. It was simply a picture of Moses with the tablets in his arms, looking up to God and saying, "But what's the hypothesis?"
So Walter is a patriot, a scientist, a leader, a great surgeon, and to me and to so many others, a great, great friend.